I went to the hospital to surprise my wife on our anniversary. The nurse at the front desk smiled at me and said, "Oh, doctor, Patricia's husband is already upstairs with her." I told her she must be mistaken. She looked at me the way people look at someone they feel sorry for and said, "Sir, he comes every Wednesday." I had been married to my wife for 31 years. I knew her coffee order, her shoe size, the exact way she hummed when she was reading something that interested her. I knew which side of the bed she slept on, and the name of the childhood dog she still cried about sometimes. I thought I knew everything about her. I was 63 years old, standing in a hospital lobby on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I was about to find out how wrong I was. Her name was Patricia. Most people called her Pat, but I always called her by her full name because she once told me, early in our relationship, that her father was the only person who ever called her Patricia, and she missed him. He had passed before I ever got the chance to meet him. Calling her Patricia was my small way of honoring someone she loved. 31 years, and I still called her Patricia. I thought that meant something. She was a surgeon, cardiothoracic, the kind of doctor who held people's hearts in her hands, quite literally, and I had always admired her for it. I was a retired high school history teacher, 32 years in the classroom, then retirement. While she saved lives, I had coached the debate team and graded papers at the kitchen table. We were different people, but I never thought that difference was a problem. I thought it was what made us interesting to each other. Our son lived in Seattle. He called on Sundays. Our daughter was in graduate school in Boston. She called whenever she needed money, which we gave her gladly. Patricia and I had built a quiet life in our house in Asheville, North Carolina. A good life. At least that is what I believed. I had driven to the hospital that Tuesday because I wanted to take her to dinner for our anniversary. 31 years. I had made a reservation at the restaurant where we had our first date, a small Italian place downtown that had somehow survived everything, recessions, the pandemic, the years that took so many other things. I had not told Patricia I was coming. I wanted it to be a surprise. I parked in the visitor lot, brought flowers from the garden she always said she loved but never had time to tend, and walked through the front doors feeling like a man who had everything figured out. The nurse at the desk was a young woman with red hair and a kind face. I told her I was there to see my wife, Dr. Patricia Calloway. I said I was her husband, and that I wanted to surprise her. The young woman's smile shifted slightly. Not disappeared, just changed shape into something more careful. She typed something into her computer, looked at the screen, and then looked back at me with that expression, the one I would come to think of as the face people make right before they hand you something heavy. She said, "Doctor, Calloway's husband is already here. He arrived about an hour ago." I laughed. I told her that was impossible, because I was her husband, and I had just driven 40 minutes from our house. The young woman did not laugh with me. She picked up her phone and spoke quietly into it, and within 2 minutes a hospital administrator named Gerald came down to the lobby. He was a soft-spoken man in a gray suit who asked me to follow him to a small office off the main corridor. And I followed him because that is what you do when a man in a gray suit asks you to follow him. Gerald sat across from me at a small table and asked me to spell my last name. I spelled it. He looked at his computer. He asked me my wife's date of birth and our home address. I gave him both without hesitating. He looked at the screen for a long moment, and then he looked at me and said, "Sir, there is a man on the 4th floor right now who has been listed as Dr. Calloway's emergency contact and spouse for the last 4 years." I sat with that sentence for a moment, the way you sit with a sudden loud noise before your brain processes what it was. 4 years. I asked Gerald what the man's name was. He said he could not share that information with me. I asked if my wife knew I was in the building. He said he had not contacted her yet, and he was asking me how I would like to proceed. I told him I would like to proceed by going upstairs. He looked uncertain. I told him I had been married to Dr. Patricia Calloway for 31 years, that I had our marriage certificate in a filing cabinet at home between our tax returns and our mortgage papers, and that I intended to walk upstairs and speak to my wife. Gerald made a phone call. I waited. He spoke quietly. There was a pause on his end that went on long enough that I began to hear my own heartbeat. Then he nodded, hung up, and said, She's asking you to wait here for a few minutes. She knew I was there. She needed a few minutes. I thought about that for a long time while I sat in that small office with the motivational poster on the wall and the fake plant in the corner. What does a person do with a few minutes when they have just been told something like that? I looked at the flowers I was still holding. Garden roses, pale pink, the kind Patricia had planted along the back fence when our son was in middle school. I set them on the table. Gerald offered me water. I took it. I thought about the last 4 years. I tried to construct a timeline the way I used to teach my students to construct timelines, with a clear starting point and a logical sequence of events. What had changed 4 years ago? Patricia had taken a new position at the hospital, a department head role that came with longer hours. She had started attending more conferences. She had bought a new car, a gray sedan that she said was more practical for the longer commute. She had joined a professional organization that held monthly dinners she occasionally attended without me because, she said, they were mostly for hospital staff. 4 years of Wednesdays. Gerald's phone buzzed. He looked at it and said, "She'll come down now." I heard her before I saw her. Her shoes on the hallway floor, that specific click I had memorized over 3 decades. She came into the office and closed the door behind her, and she did not look surprised to see me. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with her shift. She sat down across from me where Gerald had been sitting, and Gerald quietly excused himself. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said, "Happy anniversary." She closed her eyes. Just for a second. Then she opened them and said, "I know how this looks." I told her I thought it looked pretty straightforward. She said it was complicated. I told her that everything becomes complicated when people decide to make it complicated, and that I would prefer if she just told me plainly what had been happening. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she told me. His name was Richard. She had met him at a cardiology conference in Atlanta 4 years ago. He was an administrator for a hospital group in Charlotte, which was close enough that seeing him was easy to arrange. He had been listed as her emergency contact because, and here she paused and looked at me with something that was not quite apology, because she had started to feel that he understood her life in a way that I did not. She said her work had changed her in the last several years, that the things she carried home from that job were things she could not explain to someone who had not lived them, and that Richard worked in the same world even if not in the same way. I asked her what she had told him about me. She said she had told him the truth, that she was married, that she had a life at home, that she was trying to figure out what she wanted. I asked her what he had told her. She said he had told her he loved her. I looked at the roses on the table between us. I had grown those roses myself. Pruned them, watered them, covered them with cloth in the winter frosts. Patricia had not touched them in years. She was always too busy. I asked her how many people at this hospital knew about Richard. She looked uncomfortable. I told her that a nurse at the front desk had told me her husband was already upstairs without any hesitation, which meant this was not a secret from the people she worked with every day. She did not deny it. She said that people in the department knew, yes, and that she was sorry I had found out this way. I told her I was sorry too. Not for me, in that moment. I was sorry for the 31 years I had spent believing I was building something real. She said, "You were. What we built was real." I asked her how something real had a man's name listed as her emergency contact for 4 years. She had no answer for that. I hadn't expected one. I picked up the roses and stood up. I told her I was going to go home and call our son and our daughter and let her handle explaining things to them in whatever way she thought was best. I told her I would not be at the house when she returned. She asked where I was going. I told her I was going to take myself to dinner on our anniversary because I had a reservation and I had not eaten since breakfast, and I intended to use it. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "You deserve better than this." I told her I knew that. And then I left. I drove downtown alone and I sat at a table for 2 at the Italian restaurant where we had our first date. The waiter noticed the empty chair and asked if I would like him to remove the second setting. I told him to leave it. I ordered the pasta Patricia had always ordered on every occasion because she said it was the best thing she had ever eaten, and I ate it slowly, and I thought about things. I thought about the first time I had called her Patricia instead of Pat and the look on her face when I explained why. I thought about the night our son was born and how she cried in a way I had never seen her cry. This woman who was calm under any pressure, undone completely by holding her own child. I thought about the summer we drove to Maine because she wanted to see the coastline, and we got lost twice and ate lobster out of paper trays at a picnic table and laughed more than we had in years. I thought about all of that, and I let myself feel the weight of it, and then I paid the check and I went home. I slept in the guest room that night. Not because I was asked to, but because I needed the separateness of it. In the morning I called my son in Seattle. He did not take it well. He was angry in the loud and immediate way that young men are angry when they feel their family is threatened. I told him to breathe. I told him that whatever happened, his mother was still his mother, and that his anger would keep better than his relationship with her would, so he should spend it carefully. My daughter cried. She asked me if I had known anything was wrong. I told her honestly that I had not, or at least that I had not let myself know, which might be different. She asked what would happen now. I told her I didn't know yet, but that I would. Patricia came home 2 days later. She had stayed with a colleague. We sat at the kitchen table for a long time, and we talked more honestly than we had talked in probably 10 years. She told me that she had not been unhappy with me, exactly, but that she had been lonely in a way she had not known how to say. I told her that loneliness is something you have to say out loud, because the other person cannot see it, and that if she had told me, things might have been different. She said she knew. She said she thought she had been waiting until she figured it out herself, and that the figuring had taken too long. I asked her if she loved Richard. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said yes. I appreciated that she didn't soften it. After everything, at least she gave me that. We talked about the house and the finances and the children. We talked about what a separation would look like. Patricia had a lawyer she wanted to use, someone she trusted, and she asked if I would work with that person or if I preferred my own. I told her to give me the name and I would think about it. There was no anger in that conversation. Not really. The anger had burned off somewhere between the restaurant and the morning, leaving something quieter and more permanent. We sold the house in the fall. I moved into a smaller place on the west side of Asheville, a 2-bedroom craftsman with a yard I planned to fill with the same kind of garden I had kept for 30 years. Patricia moved to Charlotte, closer to Richard and closer to a new position she had been considering for months. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in November, which happened to be, oddly, my birthday. I do not know if that was accidental, or if some part of the universe has a sense of humor. My son flew in from Seattle that weekend. Not because of the divorce being finalized, he didn't know the date, but because he said he wanted to check on me. We went to a football game at a small college nearby, and ate terrible stadium food and argued pleasantly about which direction the country was heading, the way fathers and sons argue when they're really just glad to be sitting next to each other. It was a good day. My daughter visited in December. She helped me arrange furniture in the new house and made something complicated for dinner that required 3 pots and a lot of instructions, and we watched old movies until midnight. She fell asleep on the couch, and I covered her with the blue blanket that had been in our family since she was an infant, and I sat in the armchair and I looked at my daughter sleeping, and I felt, for the first time in a long while, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I joined a men's hiking group in January. Ridiculous. I thought at first, a retired teacher in hiking boots on a trail with a dozen other men he had never met. But the trails in the mountains around Asheville are something else entirely, and the men in that group were mostly quiet, mostly decent, mostly carrying their own versions of things they didn't say out loud. We hiked every Saturday morning and ate breakfast after at a diner on Marymount Avenue, and over the months I learned their names and their histories, and they learned mine, and none of it was dramatic. At one of those Saturday breakfasts, about 4 months after I joined, the man who sat across from me regularly, a retired contractor named Dale, who had lost his wife to cancer 3 years prior, asked me how I was doing with everything. I told him honestly that I was doing better than I expected. He nodded and said, "That surprises people, doesn't it?" "That better is possible." I said it did. He said, "I think what surprises people is that better doesn't mean forgetting. It means the weight redistributes. Doesn't go away, just moves to a place you can carry." I thought about that for a long time after. I thought about it when I planted the new garden in the spring, when I found a rhythm to the smaller, quieter life I was building. I thought about it when Patricia called in February to tell me that she and Richard had gotten engaged, and I sat with the phone in my hand and waited for whatever I was going to feel, and what I felt was something close to tired. And then, under that, something close to peace. I told her I hoped she was happy. I meant it, in the way you can mean something painful. She said, I hope you know that what we had was real, even at the end. I told her I had decided to believe that, because the alternative was to look back at 31 years and see nothing, and I was not willing to do that. I was not built for bitterness. I had watched people build themselves around bitterness, had seen it in students, in colleagues, in my own father after certain disappointments, and I knew that whatever I became from here, I did not want that. My son called more often after the divorce than he ever had before. Once a week, then twice. Sometimes he called just to talk about nothing: his job, a movie he watched, a restaurant he found. I think he was checking on me, and I let him, because that is also what fathers do. They let their children take care of them when the children need to feel useful. My daughter finished her graduate program in the spring. I drove to Boston for the ceremony. I sat in the audience in a gymnasium that smelled like old hardwood and watched her cross the stage in her cap and gown, and she was so young and so certain and so bright that I felt an ache I could not fully name. Pride, certainly. And something else, some awareness of time, of how fast it moves, of how the things you love most in your life do not stand still waiting for you to pay attention to them. Afterward, at dinner, she asked me if I was lonely in the new house. I told her that lonely was not the right word. I told her I had been lonelier, in some ways, in the last few years of a marriage that had quietly become something other than what I thought it was, than I was now, in a house that was genuinely mine. She looked at me like she was deciding whether to believe that, and I told her she could take her time deciding, but that it was true. I turned 64 in November of that year. Dale and a few of the men from the hiking group came over. I made chili from a recipe my mother had given me 40 years ago. Someone brought cornbread. Someone else brought a bottle of whiskey that was better than anything we deserved on a Tuesday night. We sat around the kitchen table until late and talked about the things men talk about when they stop performing and just sit together: regrets, yes, but also the odd particular joys that are only possible once you're old enough to recognize them as joy. At some point, one of the men asked me what I would tell my younger self, if I could. The question that gets asked at every gathering of men over a certain age, as reliable as the weather. I thought about it genuinely. I thought about the nurse in the hospital lobby and the roses on the table and the Italian restaurant and the guest room and the phone call to my son. I thought about 31 years and what lives inside them. I said I would tell my younger self to pay attention differently, not to work harder or love more, because I do not think I was deficient in those things, but to pay attention to what is actually there rather than what you have decided should be there. Because the gap between those two things is where trouble grows, quietly, over years, until the morning you drive to a hospital with roses from your own garden, and a nurse looks at you and tells you your wife's husband is already upstairs. I said I would tell him that the gap is not your fault alone, but it is your responsibility to close it. And that if it cannot be closed, if the person across from you is no longer building toward the same place, then the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for them is to stop building and let it be what it is. The men around the table were quiet for a moment. Then Dale said, "That's the most words I've ever heard you say at one time." Everyone laughed, including me. On Saturday mornings, I still walk the trails above the city. The mountains here are old mountains, rounded by time rather than jagged, and there is something in that I find useful to look at. Old things worn smooth. Still standing. Still worth climbing. I am 64 years old and I live alone in a house with a garden I tend carefully and a kitchen table where friends sit on Tuesday nights. I talk to my children more than I did when I was trying to hold a life together that had already come undone. I know the names of the men I hike with, and they know mine. And on the trails we do not talk much, because the mountains are better than anything we would say. I did not expect this life. I did not ask for it the way it arrived. But I have learned, in the months since that Tuesday afternoon in March, that there is a difference between the life you planned and the life that is actually yours. One of them lives on paper. The other one is what you wake up inside every morning, and it is the only one that counts. I know that now. It took 63 years, and a nurse at a front desk, and a table for two on an anniversary night, but I know it. And that, I think, is enough. Sometimes the most disorienting moment of your life turns out to be the one that finally sets you straight. This man lost 31 years of certainty in a hospital lobby, and yet he walked out of it slowly, honestly, into something more genuinely his own. The weight never fully lifts, but as his friend Dale said, it redistributes. And a life rebuilt with open eyes, good chili, and Saturday morning trails is still a life worth climbing toward. A small note to our listeners. This story was created and imagined by AI, crafted to offer you a moment of meaningful entertainment, and, perhaps, a quiet reminder that even the hardest chapters can lead somewhere worth arriving.